there is a growing criticism over some European countries' ways of dealing with the influx of African migrants. A few months ago, the United Kingdom, under the previous Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, was criticized for its failed deal with Rwanda. The plan intended to send upwards of 50,000 asylum seekers to Rwanda from the UK. Now, to discuss whether this strategy works and who it benefits, I am joined now by Professor Ali Bhagat, the Assistant Professor of the School of Public Policy at Simon Fraser University in Canada. Doc, a pleasure to have you on the program this evening. Can you firstly explain the concept of offshoring asylum seekers and refugees? And how did this practice evolve? And what are its main characteristics here?
Thank you so much for having me. So offshoring, also known as border externalization, is the practice really of Western nations, usually richer countries, offshoring their duties of refugee governance onto poorer nations. So the model for this, of course, starts in Australia through the use of a small island nation like Nauru to send their asylum claimants overseas, basically taking the various issues you might have with processing migrant claimants and saying, okay, you're not allowed in our country, we're going to ship you off somewhere else. So that's, in a nutshell, the process.
But what are the primary human rights concerns which are associated with offshoring asylum seekers to other countries? Can you provide specific examples of abuses that have occurred during these practices?
So largely the human rights abuses concern torture, human abduction, gender-based violence, other forms of sexual violence. And this has come out in cases like Libya. So what we saw in an EU study itself on this practice, the whole purpose of the Libyan, offshoring deal, so to speak, was to prevent migrants from coming from the African continent towards the EU. And what ended up happening here was Coast Guard, various other agents, informal agents, ended up encamping people, and many people faced all sorts of human rights abuses in this type of thing. So that's one specific example, but you can also imagine that in getting people that have already taken lots of debt, perhaps, but also faced all sorts of violence in trying to cross borders and get into the EU and other countries, you can see how turning them away and placing them in other situations inherently in design is itself violent as well.
But Prof, how does offshoring impact a backsliding democratic regime? And what are the implications of the funding of these kind of regimes for really managing refugees as well?
I mean, this is a really good question. And the thing is, we all exist in a post-colonial moment, right? Particularly when you're from the global south. And, in this context of empowering authoritarian regimes or regimes that are, or countries that are, facing backsliding in democracy, you are in effect saying, okay, well, you're lining the pockets of many of these people that back these regimes. And importantly as well, you're basically saying this regime doesn't deserve or doesn't need international scrutiny. So we're getting the kind of international pressure on these regimes eased off because you're basically saying, yeah, this is a safe place to send people, basically limiting any sorts of human rights abuses that limiting the visibility of those human rights abuses.
So the EU has made deals with countries like Libya, Mauritania, and even Tunisia. How have these agreements performed in terms of really managing migration? And what have been the notable outcomes or even failures that we've seen here?
I mean, look, it depends on the perspective you're going to adopt, right? Have there been reductions in crossings? Probably. Has there been some element of containment? Probably. But if we think about human rights violations, then all of these have failed, are dismal failures, basically. And, at the end of the day, this is not a sustainable way to stop people because migration, people are considered forcibly displaced because they are escaping some sort of severe, whether political, economic, conflict-ridden violence, and you can't stop that by just kind of having containment strategies.
In preparing for this interview, one article highlighted the high costs associated with offshoring practices. How do these costs compare to, call it, alternative methods of managing asylum seekers and refugees?
And so, I mean, this is obviously in reference to an article I co-wrote with my colleague, Genevieve Baron. And the article highlights that basically, any sort of offshoring deal has resulted in all sorts of high costs, even to the Western nations, right? And we actually don't really know what the comparison is, but the numbers that we see where asylum offshoring in Nauru, for example, something like 22 million Australian dollars per person, seems absurd. And so when we're thinking about these high costs and in relation to perhaps alternative strategies, maybe we should think about what does robust housing look like? What does having infrastructure for more robust adjudication of asylum claims? What does a long-term job strategy look like for asylum seekers? These are unexplored because we're in this moment of right-wing populism, not only in the EU, but almost globally. And so it seems easy to say, yeah, let's just, offshore migrants is an easy solution. But hidden in this is a deep economic cost that could be used elsewhere.
But given the high costs and frequent failures of offshoring to stop this migration, what evidence is there that these policies are effective in really achieving their stated goals here?
Well, there is an evidence. There is an evidence according to the Human Rights Watch. There's an evidence according to all sorts of international organizations and watchdogs that show that offshoring isn't actually reducing significantly the number of asylum claims anyway. Yeah, there might be, in the Libyan case, Mauritania case, Nauru case, yes, there might be some people that were prevented from, entering the country or having a full life in these Western nations. But it has not stopped or even effectively reduced to a great extent the number of people that are seeking asylum globally.
But what alternative strategies could be employed to manage refugee and asylum seeker flows, especially more effectively and humanely, without resorting to this offshoring that we are seeing?
I think this is an excellent question, and obviously I alone wouldn't have all these answers to these. However, I think this is a question of, in the global South, we need to reckon with the history of colonialism, and that requires, to some extent, debt cancellation. It requires global North countries and international organizations to commit to economic development and infrastructure development in the global South. So we're trying to create a more hospitable and economically prosperous world on one hand, and in the global North, something similar applies. I think really this is going to be a crisis of economic development and infrastructure, and that requires appropriate levels of housing, appropriate levels of job growth, and also trying to, as best as people can, to more commit to human rights as first and foremost the point of this refugee asylum system, going all the way back to the Geneva Conventions, which still need to be respected.
Prof. Bhagat, as we begin winding down our conversation, how does the practice of offshoring really affect global refugee policy and international cooperation on migration issues? Does it undermine global efforts to really address the refugee crisis?
I think this is an excellent question, and I do believe that we're setting a new standard where offshoring is becoming the name of the game with asylum, especially in the global North. I think what our article argues is the creation of a new hidden supply chain, a cruel supply chain of asylum seekers, where global North countries, similar to commodities, can trade people across borders in order to reduce their own costs. And this, in turn, allows certain countries to think, okay, well, if we can say, make a deal with the EU and say we're going to take X amount of people and bring them to our country, and we can, without any scrutiny, house them or treat them however we want. That in itself is a dangerous precedent for global refugee governance, and I think it does in fact create or perpetuate long-standing inequalities between the global North and the global South.
And finally, what do you foresee as the future of refugee governance in if offshoring continues to be this prevalent strategy. Are there any signs of policy shifts or emerging trends that might alter this current approach?
I mean, I'd hope so. I'd hope that humanitarian organizations and pressure from civil society would try to end these types of policies. But it seems to be a trend that's ticking upwards, where at least 15 EU nations, even with the scrapping of the Rwanda plan in the UK, at least 15 other EU nations have said this is the way to go. We have too many migrants. We need to basically try to offshore. And as I mentioned, I think this is a dangerous policy shift. And I think the alternative requires a lot more concentrated effort from all levels of government and international organizations, which are yet to be seen, I would say, in this current moment of mass displacement globally.
Professor Ali Bhagat, thank you so much for your time and your valuable insights into the complexities and the consequences of offshoring asylum seekers, but also refugees as well.